Hello everyone, welcome back to a video. Before we get into today's video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and always comment down below. Walkable cities are a very important thing. In my opinion, if you need a car to get around a city, it is not walkable. And there are plenty of cities in America that are very unwalkable and car dependent. Today we're going to be ranking America's largest cities from least walkable to most walkable. And walkable doesn't just mean walking. It also means biking and access to public transportation. Basically, what cities you need a car in and what cities you don't. And it seems like most cities that are pretty walkable in America, which aren't a lot, were designed before cars were a thing. So older cities typically are more walkable. Usually places that are also more densely populated and not as spread out also tend to be a lot more walkable and have better. Coming in dead last is Phoenix, Arizona. And Phoenix has a very walkable downtown. And what we'll find in most of the unwalkable cities is that they do have walkable downtowns, but Phoenix as a whole is not walkable. Most of the residential neighborhoods do not have sidewalks. And while that is not a terrible thing, major roads not having sidewalks is. Most Phoenix neighborhoods are designed with the single-family, low-density housing style where nearly all the homes look the same. None of the streets are in a grid format, making navigating the city, especially on foot, nearly impossible. There is no subway system or commuter rail. There is one light rail line for a city of over 1 million people. That is pathetic. They also have a bus network, but who wants to wait for a bus? Who wants to wait 20, 30 minutes for a bus in 110-degree weather? Not me. Our next most unwalkable city is Jacksonville, and Jacksonville is a very big city with 1 million people and is much bigger than cities like Boston, DC, and Miami. But nobody ever talks about Jacksonville, probably because it's incredibly boring. And does being unwalkable have something to do with it? Well, yeah, it's super spread out, and sure, it has a grid format, but the streets are unwalkable. There's plenty of roads that are very wide, and the signs and traffic lights are designed at a driver's level and not a pedestrian level. So people are not looking for pedestrians in the city. Also, look at this crosswalk. There is no painted sign designating that it's a crosswalk. Also, they do have a metro system, but it does not run late at night. God forbid you're coming out of the bar and you need to walk. Good luck. The third most unwalkable city is San Antonio, Texas. And San Antonio, Texas has about 1 million people, yet they only have one train station, which is an Amtrak station that has 2 Amtrak lines and it only runs a few times a day. They have a bus system, but a bus system doesn't make your city walkable, okay? And the city does have sidewalks in most parts, but it's hard to get anywhere because the city is so spread out. It's not like you can just walk to a supermarket. If you need to get like one thing at the supermarket, you should be able to walk. But in places like San Antonio, unless you live right by the supermarket, you're going to need to drive and pretty much make it an hour-long affair when it doesn't have to be. For perspective, here is the metro public transportation map of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, which has a very similar population as San Antonio, Texas. Look at the difference. Our next city is San Jose, California, and San Jose is actually the richest and most expensive city in the country, so if you don't drive, you will probably be considered poor, so that's the first problem. The second problem is there are plenty of roads that are just meant for cars and have sidewalks and bus service, but for the most part are completely designed for the car. Roads like this are worse for the environment and more expensive to maintain. And like I said before, you will probably be considered poor or lower class if you do take public transportation in San Jose. San Jose has about 1 million people and is bigger than places like San Francisco or Portland, Oregon. But here's the thing, though. Hardly anyone knows about anything in San Jose because it is a boring city. And I think that a city being unwalkable and spread out definitely has something to do with it, in my opinion. So now we're going to Austin, Texas, and something you'll notice in this video is how unwalkable a lot of Texas cities are. Austin has a major issue with traffic and many roads that have plenty of lanes for traffic but barely any room for pedestrians. There aren't a lot of bike lanes or accessibility for pedestrians in Austin, Texas. Now, there is a decent public transportation system with bus service, and there are a few light rail lines, which is a good thing. But notice on my right, notice how the sidewalk right by the railroad crossing just ends. As you can see on my right, there is no place for pedestrians to go at that intersection, except for in the other direction. But facing this direction of the road, there is no place for pedestrians to go. And these are horrible designing flaws. And I think that maybe it's intentionally. This city was completely designed for the car, which is not good. So now we're on to San Diego, California. Now we get to the point where the cities are somewhat walkable. Now, San Diego is dense, and there are plenty of sidewalks, and it's easy for walking and biking. But because the city is so big, and they don't have a ton of public transportation, you really don't have a choice but to drive here. There definitely needs to be more public transportation in San Diego. Our next city is Columbus, Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio still has many roads that are pretty much designed just for the car. However, they have a pretty walkable and pedestrian-friendly downtown, and there are plenty of streets with a grid format that are easy to navigate. The city also encourages people to take public transportation, and due to the weather not being too bad in Columbus, it is easier to walk and bike here than it would to be in somewhere like Canada or in a really hot place like Phoenix or Las Vegas. Speaking of which, Las Vegas isn't really a major city. However, if they were on this list, they definitely rank towards the bottom in terms of walkability. The next city on our list is Houston, and urban planners like to make fun at how unwalkable and how poorly designed Houston is. However, I disagree. Houston just designed a great bus network to connect just about every major street and residential neighborhood to a bus line. And there is a pretty big light rail system, and the neighborhoods around downtown and in downtown proper are very dense and walkable. However, Houston has a very long way before it is considered a very walkable city. There are many places where there are just plenty of lanes for cars but no sidewalk, or places where the sidewalk just ends. There are tons of residential neighborhoods that have no sidewalks at all, and there's very little consideration for pedestrians. But what we also have to realize is Houston is the largest city in America in terms of size. So a car is pretty much necessary, and public transportation can take very long. So sometimes you need to drive. However, I'm glad that the city is making improvements, but there's still a long way to go. Now we move on to LA, Los Angeles, California, which is notorious for being unwalkable. Now, LA, similar to Houston, is huge and is very spread out, and LA's metro system is not very good. They do have light rails and some buses, but the system overall is not very good. And the only really walkable place in LA is downtown, and downtown is tiny, and half of it is homeless encampments, so you really can't even walk through it. Most of LA is completely designed by car, and it's really the only way to get around LA efficiently. I mean, just look at the highways. Some of these highways have like 10 lanes for cars, yet there's still a ton of traffic. LA's made improvements, and there are plenty of bike lanes, sidewalks, and it is easy to access nearby places, and there's always a commercial district, but LA is still pretty pathetic in terms of walkability. So number 8 is Dallas, Texas. Dallas, Texas does have a reputation for being somewhat unwalkable. However, I think it's pretty decent. The downtown area is walkable. Most streets have sidewalks, and some have bike lanes, and most people have pretty good access to public transportation. However, there are still a lot of places around the Dallas area that are unwalkable. But I think that overall, compared to a lot of U.S. cities, they do a pretty good job. And also, most of Dallas is in a grid format, and that's good for people who are walking or biking, because neighborhoods that are not are very hard to navigate and can literally be like mazes. So grid formats definitely help so you don't get lost. Not too far away from Dallas is Dallas's sister city, Fort Worth. They both have very similar populations and are very large cities. However, most people kind of just consider them to be kind of like neighbors, and Fort Worth is definitely the forgotten one. However, it is probably the most walkable city in Texas. There are plenty of business areas that are walkable, of course, downtown, and there's also a commuter train which connects Dallas and Fort Worth and the nearby suburbs, which is good. And for a lot of cities that are in the middle of the country, having commuter train service is actually a big deal. So good for you guys. So number 6 is San Francisco, and now we're getting into the point of the video where we are in very walkable cities. However, I don't think San Francisco is too walkable because of the extremely steep hills. However, the dense urban design and the large sidewalks and narrow streets definitely make it accessible for not just drivers. And they do have a very large transportation system called BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. So getting around San Francisco, if you don't have a car, is pretty easy. And of course, they have their trolley system as well. However, I definitely don't recommend biking in this city unless you're going downhill, because these hills in San Francisco are just insanely steep. Even walking up them can be very, very difficult. So I think public transportation or car driving is the way to go in San Francisco. So we're now in the top 5, and we are in Boston, Massachusetts. And Boston, Massachusetts is a great city for walking, especially in the downtown areas, but even in the suburbs and surrounding neighborhoods are very pedestrian friendly. There are plenty of bike lanes, and the T, which is Boston's transit system, is very reliable. There's also plenty of commuter rail in the suburbs, so getting into Boston, you don't even need a car. And considering how expensive Boston is, it's nice to know that you don't need a car, which would just be added extra cost, especially if you live in the downtown area. Boston's also a very old city, which is probably why it is so walkable, because it's just very dense and crowded and old. Our next city on this list is Washington, D.C., the capital of America. Of course, Washington, D.C., being such an old and densely populated city, definitely helps with the walkability. They have one of the greatest public transportation systems in America. The Washington, D.C. Metro is very large and goes well out into the suburbs, even into Maryland and further out into Virginia. So, obviously, a very reliable metro system, walkable streets, and because it is such a popular city for tourists, you don't really have to rent a car or drive into DC to have a good time. It's a very walkable city and is very densely populated, which is good for this list. Number 3 is Chicago, and Chicago is a very underrated city in terms of walkability. Chicago is in a grid format, so it is easier to get around, and the city is very pedestrian friendly in just about every single neighborhood. Of course, they also have their great public transportation system, the CTA, which has great bus service and several subway lines throughout the city. They also have a commuter rail service called Metra. However, Metra is infrequent and unreliable, and it's also a very dated system. However, if you can look past Metra, I think that Chicago is one of the most walkable cities in America, and it's also not a very expensive city either. The second most walkable city in the U.S. is Philadelphia. Now, saying that Philadelphia is historic is an understatement, and because Philly is so old, it was designed before cars. There are plenty of narrow streets and lack of parking, so sometimes walking or biking is the best option in the city. They also have the SEPTA transportation system, which has buses, trolleys, light rails, subways, and commuter rail. So there is a lot of access to public transportation. It's also very, very frequent, especially the bus service. However, SEPTA is not a very reliable system. In my experiences on riding it, the buses are always over 10 minutes late, and that happens very frequently. However, there's plenty of late-night service for both buses and trolleys, so that is something to keep in mind. You really do not need a car to live anywhere in Philadelphia, and it is very walkable. And the most walkable city in America, to the surprise of absolutely no one, is New York City. New York City is designed for pedestrians. In fact, with the large sidewalks, just about every street having a bike lane, and having one of the world's biggest public transportation systems, all make New York City the most walkable place in America. In fact, most New Yorkers don't even drive because it's that much of an inconvenience. If you have a car here, you will be miserable. Parking is extremely expensive and the traffic can be insane. So walking, biking, or taking public transportation is highly recommended. The New York City subway gets a bad rap for being dirty, dangerous, and sometimes unreliable. However, it is the fastest and most reliable way to get around the city. And the bus system is a lot cleaner and safer, but it can be a little bit slower. However, it's usually on time or early, so that's very good. Just about every borough is extremely walkable. Now, Staten Island is pretty car dependent, but there is still plenty of bus service in and around Staten Island. In fact, New York City is actually better if you walk, bike, or take public transportation. Most New Yorkers don't drive because it's too much of a hassle. And overall, I think that's a great thing about New York City. New York City is very similar to a lot of European cities in that sense, and it is great in terms of urban planning. The whole city is a grid, so it's almost impossible to get lost here. That's going to finish it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed. This was just to take a look at America's largest cities and comparing them from most walkable to least walkable. So I hope you guys